Okay, just a little bit more on this example that I think you'll find actually quite interesting and useful. Oh, I forgot to mention, you notice that the paging control disappeared, right? That's because we only ever have a single record in our data set that our details view is bound to. So the pager just disappears. We don't have to remove it because there's only ever one record, because we're always filtering for one doctor only, because our select procedure is the one that returns a single doctor by ID. Okay, now, but we've got our database error handling there for our delete if there's related child records, but we haven't fixed the problem that the first and last name are required. The technique we learned last week was to take those columns, right, go into edit fields, select them and template them, convert them to template fields and so on. But I'm going to show you a different approach that works 99% of the time and is far, far easier, and it also is more dry in the terms that you're not repeating yourself over and over again, creating these same data source controls everywhere. All right. Now, one thing I really should have done is I should have added my CSS style sheet instead of making this red. So let me do that first. So I'm going to come in here, add a style sheet, call it MO styles. And here's where I'm just going to add that class, DD validator. Remember I mentioned that this is the one that we're going to, well, that's kind of silly. Curly braces works better. Color red. Okay, so I'll just save that style sheet. We might add more stuff to it later, but I'll apply that style sheet to this page, just dragging and dropping it, right? And now I can come into this label, and instead of hard coding in the forecolor of red, I'll delete that, and I'll set the CSS class to my DD validator. Okay, so as I said, what we've done in the past is we've come in here, right? See how I templated the command field? I got all that data instead of one row, right, by templating the command field. But right now our bound fields are still here, first, middle, initial, last name, right? So instead of templating them, going in and adding validation, required field validators just to make sure something has been entered for first and last name, I'm going to show you a different approach altogether. So I have a whole 3-slide, counting the title, really just 2-slide PowerPoint here on dynamic validation. Okay, so let me just get the slideshow up. Ready? Drum roll. Oh, I could get a sound effect for that. Oh, well, that's okay. The dynamic data project, there was an initiative done early on in the web development here at Microsoft called dynamic data. Lots of good stuff came out of it, right? One of the nice things was they pioneered the use of metadata coming from classes to dynamically create elements in the user interface. Our web forms are not the same thing as a dynamic data project, but we can make use of this metadata approach and make our lives much, much easier, right? So as I say here, web forms don't rely on dynamic data. We can take advantage of this in most circumstances. What we have to do then is we have to create a class. This metadata is based on knowing information about the class. The class should correspond to the entity that we're working with. Think of a database table, right? Whether it's patients or doctors or players or teams or leagues or whatever that entity is, right? Now, because we aren't using this class for anything else but providing metadata, we can be really sloppy. We don't have to include all the fields, right? All the properties in the class, just the ones that we want to provide some metadata for, some information about its validation requirements, okay? And then we'll add data annotations that indicate what the required validations are. And that's the nuts of it, right? The bolts come in, then we just tell the bound controls to use dynamic validation controls, right? And that's it. We really just have to link it up by enabling dynamic data on the bound control itself. It's probably easier to see in action than it is to read the points off my slide, but we'll come back to the slide in summary. So first thing I have to do is I have to add a class. The models folder that was added when we checked off that checkbox for adding the core functionality for web forms, it's a perfect place to put model classes, right? So I can right-click the models folder, add a class, Okay. Now you worked with classes in your object-oriented programming course, right? So you know what a class looks like. This is just going to be a simple class. I'll name the class Doctor. So it might as well correspond to my Doctor entity. Public class Doctor. Public is important, otherwise it's not accessible everywhere in my application. So you've seen this approach to creating properties before, right? We have our snippets. So I go prop, right? There's prop full, there's the condensed properties, right? For an automatically implemented property and so on. If I go prop full, then you just go tab tab, and it breaks it out for you. You've seen this before? Yeah? Some people are not too sure if they have. This is the approach that creates the private variable and the public property and so on, kind of the full-blown way to create a property, right? We don't really need all of that. All I need is, oh, I got an extra curly brace there. I just go prop, tab tab, and this automatically implemented property is all I need. So I need a data type, okay? So I really just have the first and last name. The fact that there's other fields in the database table for doctor, I don't care. It's only the first and last name I'm concerned about. And because this isn't a real class I'm relying on for anything else, I can leave out things like the primary key. Don't care, right? So they're both strings as far as C# is concerned, so I just put string as the data type, tab again to the name. The names here do have to match the names in the database table. If you're not sure, you can always go back down to your database, right, and have a look, right, in the Server Explorer, and the table, the doctor table. So first name, last name. Middle initial, there's no requirement, right? So I don't even need that. I just need first name and last name. So first name, and I'll just press N to go to the end of the line, and then do the same thing, prop, tab tab, string, tab, last name. I usually go to the end and press enter, just gets rid of all the highlighting on the line. Okay, so it's not a full representation of my doctor entity, it's just the two fields I care about for validation. And that's all I'm using this for, that's good enough. Now how do we actually put some annotations on here to indicate validation? Well, I can add the using first, or I can have the system help me add it. The easiest thing is I remember the word required, right? So if I put the square bracket, that's how you do annotations. It's extra information about a property in a class is an annotation. You put it in the square brackets. So if I type required, notice it didn't come up in IntelliSense yet because I don't have the namespace for it yet. So whenever you're working in classes and you get this red underline, notice my yellow light bulb is saying, hey, I can probably help you here. When I click that, it has different suggestions on how to fix the problem. The top one is saying, well, why not add a using for system.componentModel.data annotations. That's a namespace that contains all these annotations that we want. Okay, so I'll say, yes, please, help me out. So you see it added that using up top, so now my class knows what the required annotation is, right? So it has other options. I can specify things like allow empty strings, an error message, so on and so forth. There's other things I can add to the annotation. Error message is the thing I really want in this case. So I can give my own error message equals and provide a string here, right? That my user interface, as well as knowing that this is required information, it can actually use this error message to dynamically show me what the issue is. Right? Error message, you cannot leave the first name blank, something like that, right? And then I'll do the same type of thing. I can even copy and paste, right? That required attribute, the last name. I'll change it a little more. Empty. Empty. Right? There we go. So I provided through my data annotations information about these particular fields. They're required, and if you don't supply information, this is the error message I want to show. Okay. So I'll just save that, right? Now, what we have to do over here, maybe I'll do it a step at a time. If I go to the code behind page, as I mentioned in the PowerPoint slide, we have to enable use of dynamic data based on the class, right? That has to be done in the page init. Page load, unfortunately, is too late. It's already started to build some of the elements of the page. So we have to say, even before it started constructing everything, when it's first initializing the page, we need to actually give this command. So it's the easiest way to get a page init event in here. It's built in because it inherits it from page, but to add the snippet, easiest thing is copy your page load and change load to init. Like that. Oh. Okay, I'll take that out of there. That's the easiest way to get the page init event handler in place, right? It's already part of page, so we're not creating something that doesn't exist, that inherits this, but to give us access to it, that's the easiest way. So inside here, I'll then, as I say, my details view, doctors, dot, enable dynamic data. It's right here in IntelliSense. Now I have to pass an argument. Okay, I have to say what type of entity, the class that corresponds to the data I'm working with as I focus on my details view, which is a doctor, right? So I have to say type of, right? And in brackets, I put doctor, because that's the name of the class file that I just created a minute ago, was doctor. If I'd called it Fred, I could put Fred here, and that would still work because at that point it would just look at the field names. But that would just confuse me, so I might as well use the proper name of the doctor, right? Doctor. And then it's the semicolon at the end of the line. Now it's complaining, well, for one thing I spelled it with 2 C's, but that's not the only reason. It's complaining because it says, hey, what is a doctor, right? I don't know, are you missing a using directive? I don't know if it'll actually, oh, look at that. Using medical office S18.models. So it looks around in the project, found a class by the name of doctor, and said, well, you know what, you have to add the using for that namespace so I'll fully understand what a doctor object is. Okay, there we go, and now it's no longer underlined in red. So just to recap, we created this class called doctor. Okay, I'm faking some properties here, basically, that I'll never use except for providing this metadata, that a property called first name is required and has this error message and so on, right? In the page initialization, I enable dynamic data on my details view, right, based on that type, the class I just created. Now the last thing I do then, instead of turning these into template fields and manually adding these validation controls and so on and so forth, right, because I have to add 4 of them, right, into the insert and the update modes, okay, templates for each of those fields. That'd be 4 validation controls. I just change bound field to dynamic, MIC. Oh, not the middle initial, sorry. That'll give an error message, so that's okay. You might get this error message at some point in the future and you'll understand why. So I'm saying these are all going to be dynamic fields. Now let's just run this again. We'll see what happens. Oh, I meant to put a validation summary on. Well, we'll see it first, then we'll add that in a second because I got to fix that other error anyway. Okay, table doctor does not have a column named middle init. In other words, my class that I created, I said that there would be metadata coming for a dynamic field for middle initial, but I didn't include that in the class. So that's where you get this error message, right? Okay. So one of 2 things, I could actually go to the class and add the middle initial property, even though it's not required, or I could just leave this as the bound field that it was. I don't really need to change it otherwise. So just by leaving that as a bound field instead of a dynamic field, then it won't look for metadata about middle initial. And before I leave this page though, let me just add a validation summary control. Come back here, go down to validation. Throw on a validation summary. please. Sorry. Please fix the following. Maybe I'll show it on the page for a change instead of doing that. So I'll just set the CSS class to my DT validator. Okay. All right, so this time it comes up without that error message because it's no longer looking for, right, metadata about the middle initial, right? But if I go edit, oh, darn, thank you, Mr. Error Message, for telling me that I need my unobtrusive JavaScript fix, okay? It's the first time I've used validation controls. No problem. We can do that, right? Go into web config. Down here is where I need to add that anywhere inside the configuration, right? Usually do it at the bottom here. Come to Blackboard. Grab that little fix for unobtrusive JavaScript. Paste that in, and there we go. So that'll solve that problem. One more time into the breach. Okay, so if I edit, all right, now I get the star there right away. So it actually has created the required field validator for me based on the metadata from the class. If I click update, my validation summary is using the actual error message that I provided in my class, right? I'll just cancel. If I click new and click insert, then both of them come up, right? Now, isn't that a lot easier than creating, templating those columns, going in and adding 4 separate validation controls? It might not be much less work in this case because the doctors are pretty simple, okay? But when it comes to a more complex object, believe me. Plus, it's dry again. We aren't repeating ourselves, right? If I have another page somewhere else, I don't have to create all the same validators over again. It's all in that class now, the metadata for the validation. So all I have to do is enable dynamic data and just use dynamic fields. And then on many pages, many controls and many pages, okay, it'll all get the same information. Plus, if I ever decide, well, actually I need to modify that error message, I do it in one location in the class. And the revised error message would appear anywhere needed throughout the entire application. Okay, so that's dynamic data. It's as simple as that, right? Just to bring up my PowerPoint slide once again. No, not from the beginning, right? So we added data annotations for our validation requirements, right? In page init, we just did our enable dynamic data on the type of the class on our bound control, our details view. By the way, you'll find that like if you have a grid and a details view type of situation, you really only have to do it on one, because if they're sharing the same data source, right? You don't have to do it on both, just one is enough. And instead of bound fields, we just use dynamic fields. So it dynamically will create our validations and away we go. Much, much easier indeed. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is we're going to leave the doctor's page. I'm pretty happy with it now, right? So I'll just close all of this stuff. Let's see how quickly I can get a working patient page up now. So I will add a new web form. Oh, I should stop and start recording.